a boy lost to silence, a father lost to grief, and the mail-order bride with nothing left to lose. He offered her shelter from a merciless winter, but his offer came with a price. She had to unravel the secret that stole his son's voice. What he didn't tell her is that some secrets are buried for a reason. The train did not scream into solitude. It surrendered. Its iron wheels ground to a halt against the snow-packed rails with a weary sigh, and the hissing steam was the only sound in a world muffled by white. Eleanor Vance, Nora, pressed a gloved hand to the cold glass of the window, her breath fogging a small circle. Outside there was nothing but the station platform, a few rough-hewn planks dusted with fresh powder, and beyond it a profound and intimidating silence. The Wyoming Territory did not welcome you. It merely tolerated your presence. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. She was the only one to disembark. The conductor set her single trunk down with a soft thud that was swallowed by the snow. The cold was a physical thing, a dry, sharp presence that stole the breath from her lungs and made the fabric of her Philadelphia-made coat feel thin as paper. She pulled it tighter, a gesture of defiance against a land that seemed determined to prove her insignificance. The town of Solitude consisted of a single wide street, lined with a handful of dark wooden buildings, their shoulders hunched against the oppressive weight of a low gray sky. Her instructions were clear. The postmaster, a Meister Abernathy, would be waiting. His letters, written in a tidy, cramped hand, had been full of modest promises, a respectable life, companionship, a home. After the sickness had taken her father and her position as a governess had ended, those promises had seemed like a sturdy bridge over a chasm of uncertainty. She found the general store, which also served as the post office, its windows hazy with warmth. Pushing the heavy door open, she was met by a wave of heat and the mingled scents of wood smoke, coffee, and oiled leather. A half-dozen men in heavy coats stopped their conversations, their eyes turning to her. They were weathered faces, beards frosted with ice, and their gazes were not unkind but deeply curious. An outsider was an event. A small, balding man behind the counter looked up from his ledgers, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I am looking for Mr. Abernathy," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am Miss Vance." A flicker of panic crossed the man's face. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, I am Abernathy." He wrung his hands, refusing to meet her eyes, instead focusing on a sack of flour by the door. "There has been, you see, a change in circumstance." The warmth in the room seemed to vanish. The silence from outside crept in. "I don't understand," Nora said, though the sinking feeling in her stomach told her that she did. "My situation, it has altered," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, "as I have made other arrangements, local arrangements." He finally looked at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding she could not give. "I am truly sorry for the misunderstanding. I never should have. Well, the letters were sent." The humiliation was a hot flush that spread up her neck. To be refused was one thing. To be refused so publicly under the watchful eyes of this entire town was another. She felt their gazes, pity from some, a cold assessment from others. Her eyes swept the room and caught one gaze that was different. A woman standing behind the counter, her hair tied in a simple bun, looked at her not with pity, but with a quiet, knowing sympathy. It was the look of a woman who understood the unique shape of female disappointment. The brief connection was a single, steady point in a tilting world. Nora drew herself up to her full height. She had survived loss and poverty. She would survive this. "I see," she said, her voice betraying no tremor. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Abernathy." She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the store, leaving the scent of coffee and the weight of their stares behind her. The heavy door of the general store clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a period at the end of a sentence. Nora stood motionless on the boardwalk, her trunk a lonely island on the sea of white. For a moment she was the absolute center of Solitude's attention. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the town's quiet rhythm resumed. A freight wagon rumbled past, its driver offering a stiff, awkward nod. Two men emerged from the saloon, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a post or a snowdrift. They did not want to be involved in her misfortune. She was left alone with the cold and the vast indifference. The wind, which had been a mere whisper, now seemed to rise with a new purpose, slicing through the seams of her coat and carrying fine, stinging particles of ice. It found the exposed skin of her neck and wrists, and the chill settled deep in her bones, a perfect mirror for the icy despair that was beginning to grip her heart. Her options, she knew, were non-existent. The train that had brought her was already a distant plume of smoke on the horizon, and the next one heading east wouldn't be through for a week. Her savings, a pitifully small collection of bills and coins tucked into her reticule, might afford her a room at the boarding house for a night or two, but it would not be enough for a return ticket. She had wagered everything on Mr. Abernathy's tidy promises, and she had lost. The store door opened again, so quietly she almost didn't notice. It was the woman from behind the counter, Martha. She held a thick, dark wool shawl, its edges frayed with time and use. She didn't offer words of pity or ask probing questions. She simply stepped forward and held out the shawl. Nora stared at the offering, pride and desperation warring within her. To accept was to admit defeat, to acknowledge her need. As if sensing her hesitation, the woman's expression softened. "The air's got more bite than it looks, child," she said, her voice low and calm. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation about the weather that managed to say everything about Nora's situation. It was not pity. It was recognition. The word child broke something in Nora. A knot of pride she hadn't known she was holding so tightly came undone. Her gloved fingers, stiff with cold, reached out and took the shawl. It was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the rough wool a small but solid comfort against the biting wind. "Thank you," Nora whispered, the words barely audible. Martha gave a single firm nod, then turned and retreated back into the warmth of the store, leaving Nora alone once more. But something had changed. She was still a woman stranded, with no prospects and a future as blank and white as the landscape before her. But the shawl was a tangible piece of kindness in a world that had just shown her its coldest face. It was not a solution, but it was a shield. And for now, a shield was enough. Nora clutched the warm shawl, her mind a turmoil of impossible calculations. She took a single hesitant step toward the boarding house, the movement feeling monumental, a choice made in a world suddenly devoid of choices. It was then that the silence of solitude was violently torn apart. It began not with a shout, but with a deep, groaning crack of wood, followed by the terrifying, scraping sound of heavy runners on sheer ice. A man's voice roared from the far end of the street, a wordless bellow of alarm. "Get clear!" Nora's head snapped up. A massive timber sled piled high with freshly cut logs and drawn by two panicked draft horses was careening down the center of the street. A harness had snapped, and the driver was helpless, sawing at the reins as the load pushed the horses into a terrified, unstoppable slide. And there, standing directly in its path, was a small boy. He was thin, wrapped in a worn coat, and he stood transfixed, his gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Time seemed to slow, to thicken like molasses. Nora saw the townspeople freeze, hands half raised in warning. She saw the horse's wide, terrified eyes, the splintered wood of the broken harness. She saw the boy, a fragile statue about to be shattered. Something inside her, a force, deeper than thought or reason, took over. There was no calculation of risk, no moment of decision. Her life in that instant that had no value to her. The boy's had all the value in the world. She dropped her reticule, her body lunging forward off the boardwalk. Her boots slipped on the icy ground, but she found her footing, her movements fueled by a desperate, primal urgency. 2 frantic strides, and her arms were around the boy's thin frame, lifting him from his feet. She didn't have time to run clear. She threw herself sideways, twisting her body to shield his, into the deep, soft snowdrift piled against the side of the street. They landed in a silent explosion of white. A heartbeat later, the sled thundered past where the boy had stood, its passage a violent roar of wood and iron that shook the very ground. A spray of ice and bark fragments peppered the air around them. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The sled crashed into a water trough further down the street, splintering it into 1,000 pieces. The horses, trembling, finally stood still. And in the ringing silence that followed, Nora lay in the snowdrift, her heart hammering against her ribs, her arms still wrapped protectively around the child. He was unharmed, his body rigid with shock, but safe. Through the hazy window of the general store, she could just make out the shape of the woman, Martha. Her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with an expression that was no longer sympathy, but something akin to awe. The crunch of heavy boots on packed snow was the first sound to penetrate Nora's shock. A large shadow fell over her, and she looked up into the face of a man who seemed carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mountains. He was tall and broad, his face weathered by wind and sun into a mask of stoic endurance. But as his gaze fell upon the boy still huddled in her arms, that mask cracked, revealing a raw, paternal terror. He didn't speak to Nora. He didn't even seem to see her. He knelt in the snow, his large, calloused hands moving over his son with a rough gentleness, checking for injuries. "Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble deep with an aching relief. "You all right, son?" The boy, Caleb, gave a small, jerky nod, his face buried in his father's sheepskin coat. He clung to him, silent as the snow itself. Only when he was satisfied that his son was unharmed did the man finally turn his gaze to Nora. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, held a mixture of gratitude and weary appraisal. "He's not hurt," Nora managed, her voice thin. The man reached down and offered her a hand. His grip was firm, enveloping her own, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. He did not release her hand immediately, his eyes searching her face. "I saw what you did," he said. It was not a thank you, but yet it was a statement of fact, weighted with an unspoken debt. He released her, his attention turning back to his son. It was then that he seemed to place her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had been in the store, he had seen her public humiliation. The store door opened, and Martha emerged, carrying a steaming tin mug of coffee. She walked past Nora and handed it to the man, a silent gesture of support and respect that did not go unnoticed. He took it with a nod, the steam warming his chapped face. He took a slow sip, his gaze moving from Nora's face to her single, forlorn trunk on the platform. He was a man accustomed to solving problems, and before him stood 2, his silent son and a woman with courage but no place to go. "My name is Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice direct, stripped of all pleasantry. "That's my son, Caleb." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I need someone for the boy. He hasn't spoken. Not a word since his mother passed last winter." The admission was stark, offered without a hint of self-pity. It was a problem laid bare like a broken piece of machinery. The work would be keeping him company. His letters, trying to draw him out. The house is remote. The winter is long. He looked her square in the eye. I can offer room and board, fair wages come spring. It's honest work, hard work. Nora looked from Silas's hard, honest face to the silent boy clutching his father's leg. She looked at the bleak, snow-covered street and the empty railroad tracks leading back to a life that no longer existed. This was not the future she had imagined, but it was a future. It was a path forward where moments ago there had been only a wall of ice. It was a lifeline disguised as a business transaction. I accept your offer, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. Silas Blackwood was a man of few words and efficient action. He retrieved Nora's trunk from the platform, lifting it into the back of his buckboard sleigh as if it were filled with feathers, and helped her onto the wooden seat. Caleb scrambled up to sit between them, a small, rigid barrier of silence. Without another word, Silas clicked the reins, and the horses leaned into their harnesses, pulling them away from the town and into the vast, empty canvas of the Wyoming winter. The town of Solitude vanished behind the first rolling hill, and Nora felt a profound sense of isolation settle over her. There were no other homesteads, no fences, no sign of human life, only the endless white of the snow-covered land, the dark skeletons of cottonwood trees lining a frozen creek, and the sharp, jagged peaks of the mountains on the horizon. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow and the soft, scraping whisper of the sleigh's runners. The silence between the three passengers was as deep and vast as the landscape around them. After nearly an hour, Silas guided the sleigh down into a shallow valley protected by a thick stand of pine and aspen. There, nestled against the curve of the creek, was the ranch. It consisted of a large, sturdy-looking log house, a massive barn, and a collection of smaller outbuildings, all constructed with a clear eye for permanence and practicality. It was not a welcoming place, but it was a solid one, a fortress built to withstand the worst the world could throw at it. Silas led her inside. The door opened into a large main room that served as a kitchen and living space. A fire smoldered low in a great stone hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The room was clean, almost unnaturally so. The pine floors were scrubbed bare, the dishes on the open shelves were stacked in precise piles, and there wasn't a speck of dust to be seen. But it was the cleanliness of a space that is maintained, not lived in. There were no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a house stripped of its soul, haunted by an absence that was more powerful than any presence. As soon as his boots were off, Caleb slipped away from his father's side. He didn't run. He simply dissolved into the shadows of the room, a small ghost, disappearing into an adjoining hallway without a single backward glance. "Your room is upstairs," Silas said, his voice sounding overloud in the stillness. "The end of the hall. I'll bring your trunk." He gestured toward the stove. "Pump's in the corner. We eat when the work's done, usually around sundown." He paused, as if searching for something else to say, but found nothing. He simply nodded and headed back outside. Nora climbed the creaking stairs and found her room. It was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a single wooden chair. Through its one small window, she could see nothing but the snow-blanketed fields and the dark line of trees. The silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. She stood in the center of the floor and finally understood the true weight of the bargain she had made. Her job was not simply to teach a boy his letters or to cook meals. Her task was to wage a war against the grief that had hollowed out this house and taken a small boy's voice as its prize. Looking out at the unforgiving, beautiful emptiness, the task felt quietly, terrifyingly impossible. Nora began her war against the silence not with a battle cry, but with a broom. She learned quickly that the rhythms of the ranch were governed by the sun and the needs of the sheep. Silas was gone before dawn and often did not return until dusk, leaving her and the boy to the vast, quiet emptiness of the house. So she worked. She did not try to fill the silence with chatter, but with the quiet, purposeful sounds of a home being tended. She rose in the dark to build up the fire in the hearth, its crackle and pop a welcome companion to the lonely whistle of the wind. One morning she found a sack of flour and a tin of yeast in the pantry and set to baking bread. The simple, honest work of kneading the dough was a comfort, and soon a scent that had been absent for over a year began to fill the cold corners of the house, the warm, living smell of baking bread. She saw the way Silas paused when he came in that evening, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly as he took in the scent. He said nothing, but he ate 3 thick slices with his stew, his eyes fixed on the fire. Caleb, who usually took his plate to a shadowed corner, lingered by the table for a moment, his small face turned toward the warm loaf. Nora found a basket of mending in a closet, a sock of Silas's with a worn heel, a tear in the sleeve of Caleb's small coat. In the evenings, by the light of the fire and a single oil lamp, she would stitch them with small, neat seams, and while she worked, she would read. She had found a worn copy of Aesop's Fables on a high shelf. She didn't direct the stories at Caleb, who would sit just on the edge of the firelight, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife his father had given him. Instead, she read to the room itself, her voice calm and even, letting the stories of clever foxes and foolish crows become another layer of sound in the house, a quiet counterpoint to the howling of the wind outside. A week after her arrival, Silas announced he was making a trip to town for supplies. In the general store, Martha greeted her not with sympathy, but with a nod of quiet approval. While Silas discussed feed prices with Martha's husband, the older woman measured out flour for Nora. "This is the good stuff," Martha said, her voice low as she tied the top of the sack. "From the mill down in Casper." She pushed it across the counter to us. "For the Blackwood boy. A growing child needs good bread." It was not a gift to Nora, but an investment in the boy, an acknowledgement of the work Nora was doing. It was a sign of acceptance, as solid and real as the heavy sack in her arms. On the ride back to the ranch, Nora sat straighter in her seat. The silence from Caleb and Silas was the same, the landscape just as vast and unforgiving. But something inside her had settled. She had not broken the silence or banished the grief, but she had established a foothold. She had created a routine of warmth and care, and she had begun to sow the slow, patient seeds of a new life in the frozen earth of Whispering Creek. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace built on routine and unspoken understanding. Nora began to feel the first stirrings of belonging, a warmth that had little to do with the hearth fire. It was in the late afternoon of such a day, with the scent of simmering stew in the air, that the world changed. Nora had noticed the sky. It had taken on a peculiar bruised gray color, and the air had grown heavy and still, a silence deeper than the one she had grown accustomed to. To her eastern eyes, it was merely dreary. To a man of the West, it would have been a stark warning. Caleb had been outside, just beyond the barn, where he liked to watch the sheep in their winter pen. He held the small, smooth wooden bird his mother had carved, an object he was never without. Nora went to the door to call him in for supper, but the wind snatched the words from her lips. It rose not as a whistle, but as a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. The first flakes of snow, thick and wet, began to fall. Within minutes, the flakes became a blinding, horizontal torrent. The barn, 50 yards away, dissolved into a swirling wall of white. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the house. A knot of ice formed in Nora's stomach. "Caleb," she called, her voice sharp with a sudden piercing anxiety. She searched the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. He was gone. Just then the door burst open and Silas stumbled in, driving a flurry of snow before him. He was a creature of the storm, his beard and eyebrows thick with ice. "The flock's secured," he began, his voice strained from shouting over the wind. He stopped when he saw her face. "Where's the boy?" "I thought he was with you," Nora said, her words tumbling out. "He was by the barn just before—" "It came so fast, Silas." The change in him was terrifying. The stoic, controlled man she knew vanished, replaced by someone raw with a primal fear. A muscle jumped in his jaw, and his eyes, wild and haunted, darted to the empty rocking chair by the fire. He was not just seeing an empty yard. He was seeing a ghost. He was living a nightmare for the second time. "He knows the rule," Silas bit out, the words ragged. "He knows never to wander when the sky turns gray." He didn't wait for an answer. He strode to the wall, pulling down his heaviest sheepskin coat, a coil of rope, and a lantern. He was a man preparing for war against the weather. At the door he turned to Nora, his face a hard mask of command. "You will stay here," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Bolt this door behind me. Keep the fire high. You do not, under any circumstances, leave this house." The Nora Vance, who had stepped off the train a few weeks ago, would have obeyed without question. She would have huddled by the fire, praying for their return. But that Nora was gone, replaced by a woman who had mended a small boy's coat and read him stories in the dark. She did not argue. She simply walked to the hook by the door, took down her own worn coat, and began to wrap the thick wool shawl Martha had given her around her head and neck. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and final. Silas stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Did you hear me, woman?" Nora met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. "He is my charge, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, but with a core of unbending steel. "I am not staying behind." For a long moment they stood frozen in a silent battle of wills, the roar of the storm outside a testament to the madness of what they were about to do. Silas's face was a granite mask of fury and fear, but he saw in Nora's eyes a resolve that was as unyielding as the mountains themselves. He let out a harsh, guttural sound, a sound of pure frustration, and plunged out into the whiteout. Nora was a step behind him, pulling the heavy door shut against the storm's fury. The force of the wind was a physical blow. It tore the air from her lungs and drove needle-sharp ice into any exposed skin. Visibility was less than an arm's length. The world had ceased to exist, replaced by a screaming, swirling vortex of white. Silas was a slightly darker shadow just ahead, his broad shoulders braced against the gale. He bellowed Caleb's name, but the wind ripped the word to shreds before it left his mouth. They fought their way toward the barn, the journey of 50 yards feeling like a mile. The snow was already calf-deep and drifting higher, each step a monumental effort. Silas, driven by a desperate logical fear, began heading toward the low ridge where a boy might seek shelter. But an instinct, sharp and certain, pulled Nora in a different direction, toward the sheltered cutbank of the frozen creek where she had seen Caleb playing earlier. She broke away from Silas, a decision that felt both foolish and necessary. The wind shrieked in her ears, trying to turn her back, but she pushed forward, her body aching with the brutal cold. Despair began to creep in, a cold more numbing than the wind. They were too late. The storm had already claimed him. Then she saw it. A flicker of dark color against the blinding white, half buried in a deep drift that had formed against the creek bank. It was the edge of Caleb's coat. She clawed at the snow with frozen, numb fingers, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He was curled into a tight ball, his small wooden bird still clutched in his hand. His skin was pale, his lips blue, but when she put her ear to his chest, she felt the faint, fluttery beat of his heart. She knew she could never carry him back. The storm would take them both before they made it 50 feet. Doing the only thing she could, she dragged him deeper into the slight hollow of the bank, out of the direct path of the wind. She unwrapped her coat and the precious shawl, spreading them over his small body before pulling him tight against her, trying to force the last of her own body heat into his. She buried her face in his hair, shielding him as best she could, and began to talk. Her words a desperate, rambling prayer against the storm. She didn't know how long they lay there. Time had lost all meaning. She was drifting, the cold, a heavy, comfortable blanket pulling her down into sleep, when a different sound cut through the wind. Her own name roared with such raw desperation that it seemed to shake the very air. A moment later, Silas was there, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. He fell to his knees and gathered them both in his powerful arms, his strength born of pure adrenaline. Back inside, huddled before the roaring fire, the painful process of thawing began. Silas chafed their hands and feet, his movements rough but infinitely gentle. He wrapped Caleb in the thickest wool blankets and held him in his lap, rocking him slowly. Nora, shivering uncontrollably, sat close by, unable to take her eyes off the boy. After an eternity, Caleb stirred. He shifted in his father's arms, his eyes fluttering open. He looked not at his father, but at Nora. He reached out a small, trembling hand and touched her cheek. Then, so faintly it was almost indistinguishable from the crackle of the fire, a single word escaped his lips. "Warm." Silas froze, his entire body going rigid. He looked down at his son, then across at Nora, and in the firelight, she saw the hard, stoic mask of Silas Blackwood finally completely break. The storm raged for 2 more days, imprisoning them in the small log house. But the nature of their prison had changed. Outside, the world was a howling chaos of wind and snow. Inside, a fragile peace had taken root. The oppressive, grief-stricken silence that had haunted the rooms was gone, replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of 3 people breathing the same warm air. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken awareness. The barriers of employer and employee, of stranger and resident, had been scoured away by the storm, leaving only 3 survivors bound by a shared ordeal. The change in Caleb was the most profound. The boy who had been a shadow in his own home now sought the light. He no longer ate his meals in a far corner, but sat at the table, his eyes following Nora's movements. He would appear at her elbow to hand her a piece of kindling for the fire or take a dish from her hands to set on the table. He was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not of absence, but of watchful presence. He was a boy returning to the world. Silas, too, was transformed. The hard, defensive shell he wore like armor had been cracked open. He watched Nora with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. A mixture of profound gratitude, respect, and a kind of quiet wonder. He began to speak to her of the ranch, of the different breeds of sheep, of how to read the clouds for a coming storm. It was not personal talk, but it was a form of intimacy. Nonetheless, he was sharing his life with her, piece by practical piece, treating her not as a hired governess, but as a partner. The true gift, however, came on the 3rd evening, after the wind had finally died down. As was her custom, Nora sat by the fire, reading from the Book of Fables. Silas was on the other side of the hearth, mending a piece of harness leather. Caleb, who now sat on a small stool at Nora's feet, had been listening intently, his chin resting on his hands. When she finished a story, he stood up. He walked to her and, with a small, hesitant finger, he touched the worn leather cover of the book. Nora looked down at him and smiled. He met her gaze, his own eyes wide and serious in the firelight. Then he leaned in close, and in a whisper so soft it was meant only for her, he said a second word. Book. It was a secret, a treasure offered from his world of silence into hers. It was a bond forged between them, a trust that ran deeper than words. Nora's heart swelled with a quiet, fierce joy. She didn't exclaim or draw Silas's attention to the miracle. She simply gave Caleb a small, private nod of understanding and placed her hand over his on the cover. "Yes," she whispered back, "a book." The thaw had begun. A fragile, precious warmth was spreading through the house on Whispering Creek, and Nora knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she was no longer just a sojourner waiting for the winter to end. She was home. The world emerged from the storm cleansed and silent, blanketed in a pristine layer of snow that glittered under a sharp winter sun. A sense of shared purpose, of having survived a great trial together, settled over the ranch. Silas and Nora worked to dig out the paths and secure the pens, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. Even Caleb seemed lighter, his silence now more peaceful than pained. For the first time, the future felt not like a threat to be endured, but a space to be built. The peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. They were not the slow, plodding workhorses of a neighbor, but the powerful mounts of men who rode with arrogance. 4 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the ranch, their dark figures a stark, unwelcome intrusion on the white landscape. They rode down not to the house, but to the fence line of the main sheep pen, a clear and calculated challenge. "Stay with Caleb," Silas said to Nora, his voice low and tight. "Get in the house." Nora gathered the boy's hand in hers and retreated to the porch, watching as Silas walked with a steady, unhurried gait to meet the men. The man at their head was Jedediah Kane. He was dressed in a fine leather coat that must have cost a fortune, and he sat his horse with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very land under Silas's feet belonged to him. "Blackwood," Kane called out, his voice carrying easily a echo in the still air. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders. "Heard you ran into a spot of trouble with the storm. Hope you didn't lose too many of those woolly pets of yours." "We're fine, Kane," Silas replied, his tone even. He stood with his hands at his sides, a man on his own land, unmovable. Kane's thin lips twisted into a smile that held no warmth. "That's good to hear, because winter's only just begun. It's going to be a hard one. A man needs a lot of grazing land to get his herd through a hard winter." His gaze swept over Silas's valley with a possessive air. "This is sheep country," Silas said simply. "Always has been." Kane's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure contempt. The pretense of a neighborly visit dropped away, revealing the raw, ugly truth of his presence. "My father always said this valley was meant for cattle, not for these woolly rats that spoil the land," he spat. "Your old man was a fool to think he could raise sheep here, Blackwood, and so are you." The insult hung in the cold, clean air, a poison injected into the fragile peace. It was not about business or grazing rights. It was about a deep, generational hatred. From the window, Nora watched the scene unfold. She saw the quiet, unbending strength in Silas's posture as he absorbed the insult without flinching. She saw the raw contempt on Kane's face. She had thought the blizzard was the greatest danger this land held. She realized now that the storm had been an honest enemy. This was something else entirely. This was the cold, calculating malice of a man who would take pleasure in destroying another's life. Kane gathered his reins, his point made. "You just remember that when the snow gets deep," he said, turning his horse, "this land has a way of sorting out the fools from the survivors." The 4 riders galloped away, leaving behind only the churned-up snow and a palpable sense of menace. The sun still shone, but the day had grown cold again. The weeks that followed Kane's visit were a time of tense, watchful waiting. A fragile peace held, but the threat lingered in the air like the promise of a storm. Silas grew quieter, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, his rifle never far from his hand. Nora focused on the house, on Caleb, creating a small, warm world of security against the cold unknown that lay outside. The attack came as Nora knew it would. During the worst blizzard of the season, it descended at night, a furious, shrieking monster of a storm that blotted out the moon and stars and shook the log house to its foundations. They were eating a late supper by the fire when they first heard it, a low, deep rumbling that was not thunder. It was a sound that grew steadily, a tremor in the earth that vibrated up through the floorboards. Silas was on his feet in an instant, the fork clattering from his hand. He stared at the door, his face pale in the lamplight, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "Cattle," he breathed, the single word filled with dread. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs on the wall and was shrugging into his coat before the first sounds of impact reached them. The sharp crack of splintering fence posts followed by the terrified, high-pitched bleating of the sheep. The rumbling became a deafening roar as hundreds of heavy bodies surged into the sheltered valley where Silas's flock was huddled against the storm. It was a deliberate, merciless act of destruction. "Nora, bar the door behind me," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl of pure fury. "Keep Caleb away from the windows. Don't open it for anyone but me." He plunged out into the night, a man intent on fighting a tidal wave with his bare hands. Nora rushed to the window, wiping the condensation away. What she saw was a vision from hell. In the swirling chaos of the blizzard, dark, massive shapes of longhorn cattle crashed and gored their way through the white, terrified mass of the sheep. It was a maelstrom of violence and panic, a deliberate act of war waged under the cover of the storm. Caleb stood behind her, his small hands clutching her dress, his body trembling. The old Nora would have obeyed Silas. She would have barred the door and prayed. But that woman was gone. The sight of the mindless destruction of the animals she had watched over, being slaughtered, of the life Silas had built, being torn apart, ignited a cold, hard flame of rage inside her. This was not just an attack on Silas's property. It was an attack on her home, on her family. She did not reach for a rifle. Her weapon was of a different sort. She grabbed the largest, brightest lantern, struck a match with a steady hand, and lit the wick. Turning to Caleb, she knelt and looked him square in the eye. "Stay here," she said, her voice calm and firm. "Bolt the door. I will be back." Then, pulling her shawl tight around her head, she opened the door and stepped out into the screaming chaos of the wind and the stampede. The small, steady flame of her lantern was a tiny pinprick of light in a vast, violent darkness, but it was a light she would use to save what could be saved. She was no longer a governess from the city. She was a woman of Whispering Creek, and she would not let her home be destroyed without a fight. The night was a churning nightmare of sound and fury. Nora's lantern cut a small, frantic circle in the blizzard, illuminating horrific flashes of the chaos around her. A steer, its eyes rolling white with panic, crashed past her, its horns narrowly missing her. The snow underfoot was no longer pristine, but a trampled, blood-soaked mire. In the distance, she could hear the crack of Silas's rifle, not aimed to kill, but to turn the tide, an impossible task for one man against 100 beasts. Her own goal was desperate and small. She saw a group of ewes pinned against a fence, their panicked bleating nearly lost in the roar of the storm. Holding her lantern high, she ran toward a thing, using its light and her own small presence to try and spook the cattle away, to create a path for the sheep to escape. It was a fool's errand, a single candle against a hurricane, but she did not stop. It was then she saw it, a scene of focused cruelty that stood out even in the widespread chaos. A single massive bull, separated from the herd, had cornered a lamb against the wall of the house, right below the main window. The lamb, its leg clearly broken, cried out in terror as the bull lowered its massive head, preparing to crush it. Silas was too far away, trying to prevent a dozen other small tragedies. Nora was cut off by a surge of stampeding cattle. There was nothing to be done. She watched in horror, her heart seizing in her chest. From inside the house, Caleb had seen it too. He had been obeying his father, standing away from the window, a trembling ball of fear in the dark. But the sound of the lamb's cry, the sight of the bull framed in the lantern light, was a singular, terrible image that broke through a year of frozen grief and terror. He saw this new, fragile life he had found. This life with warm bread and quiet stories, about to be snuffed out. The silence in his soul, a dam built of pain, could no longer hold. A sound ripped through the night. A sound clear and more powerful than the shriek of the wind or the roar of the cattle. It was a human voice, raw and full of a year's worth of pent-up life. No! The word was a physical force, a defiant roar from the house. For a single stunning heartbeat, the sheer, unexpected humanity of the sound seemed to create a lull in the chaos. The bull, its head lowered to strike, flinched. It shook its massive head, momentarily distracted by the sound, its murderous intent broken. The single second was all Silas needed. Hearing his son's voice cut through the storm, he spun around, raised his rifle, and fired a shot into the snow just in front of the bull. The beast snorted, startled by the gunshot and the shout, and lumbered away, rejoining the dark, destructive river of the stampede. The lamb was saved. Nora stood frozen, the lantern shaking in her hand, the chaos of the stampede momentarily forgotten. Tears she didn't know she was crying streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. The storm still raged, the danger was not over, but the true battle had just been won. Amidst the ruin and the violence, a boy had found his voice to defend the innocent. The silence of Whispering Creek had been broken forever. Dawn broke over a world remade. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a profound, almost holy silence. The sky was a pale, clear blue, and the rising sun cast a crystalline, golden light across the snow, a light that was beautiful and terribly cruel, for it revealed the full extent of the night's devastation. The valley was a ruin. The sturdy fences Silas had built were smashed to kindling. The pristine snow was scarred and trampled, a chaotic battlefield of dark, churned earth and blood, and scattered across the landscape were the still, dark forms of the sheep that had been lost. Nora worked alongside Silas in the cold morning air, a silent, efficient team. There was no need for words. The loss was too great, a tangible thing that lay heavy between them. They moved through the flock, checking for survivors, Silas's movements gentle as he tended to the injured, his face a grim, unreadable mask. Nora thought of the financial ruin this represented, of the years of hard work destroyed in a single, hateful night. But inside the house, a miracle was unfolding. Caleb was talking. He was not shouting or crying, but speaking in a low, continuous stream of rediscovered words. He walked through the main room, touching objects and naming them as if meeting old friends. "Chair," he whispered, his small hand stroking the wood. "Fire, window, spoon." When Silas came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he stopped dead in the doorway, listening. The sound of his son's voice, quiet and clear in the morning light, was a balm on the raw wound of his loss. He looked at Nora over the boy's head, and his expression was one of such profound, gut-wrenching gratitude that she had to look away. They had lost nearly a third of the flock, but he had gotten his son back. In the brutal arithmetic of the frontier, he had come out ahead. It was as he stood there absorbing the sound that Nora saw movement on the ridge. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought Cain had returned. But these were not riders. They were slow-moving wagons, 4 of them, making their careful way down into the valley. Leading the first wagon was Martha's husband, the storekeeper, with Martha herself seated beside him. Behind them were other faces from town, the blacksmith, the liveryman, a handful of homesteaders. They were not coming to gawk. The wagons were loaded with sacks of feed, tools, rolls of wire, and blankets. Martha carried a large steaming pot wrapped in quilts. She met Nora at the door, her kind face etched with concern and grim determination. "A trapper saw the whole damnable thing from the ridge," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He rode into town before dawn. We heard what Cain did." She looked past Nora to where Caleb was now chattering to his father, "and we heard about the boy." She placed a hand on Nora's arm, her grip firm. "No one stands alone in solitude, child," she said. "Not anymore." Soon the quiet of the morning was replaced by the sounds of a community at work, the rhythmic ring of hammers on fence posts, the low murmur of men's voices, the shared purpose of neighbors helping a neighbor. They had survived the storm, they had survived the attack, and now they were no longer alone. As the winter sun began its slow descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the wagons from town prepared to depart. The valley was transformed. The broken fences were patched with new timber and taut wire. The barn was secure. A sense of order had been wrestled back from the chaos. The storekeeper, his face grim but satisfied, clasped Silas's shoulder before climbing onto his wagon. "Sheriff's been sent for," he said in a low voice. "With the trapper's testimony and the whole town standing with you, Cain's time in this valley is done. You won't be troubled by him again." Silas gave a single grateful nod, his throat too tight for words. He watched as the last of their neighbors headed up the ridge, their departure a quiet promise of future support. They left behind not just repaired fences, but the knowledge that the Blackwood family was no longer an isolated outpost, but a part of the heart of solitude. When they were gone, Silas turned to Nora. He didn't speak, but gestured with his head toward the small hill that overlooked the ranch. They walked together in silence, their boots crunching in the snow. From the top they could see their whole world laid out before them. The ranch was wounded, the flock diminished, but it was still theirs. A warm yellow light now glowed from the window of the house, a beacon of defiance against the coming night. Inside they could hear the faint, clear sound of Caleb's voice as he chattered away to Martha, who had stayed behind to help with supper. The sound was the truest measure of their victory. "Last night," Silas said, his voice rough as he stared down at the light, "when I saw what he was doing, I thought I had lost everything, all over again." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes Nora saw the last of the ice finally melt away. She saw the grief he had carried for a year, the fear he had battled in the storm, and a deep, quiet reverence that was more powerful than any passionate declaration. He saw her not as a governess or a hero or a helper. He saw her as the other half of his world. "He took my sheep," Silas said, a sad wonder in his voice. "But he gave me back my son, and he showed me what was missing from this place." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was not the hand of an employer, but of a partner. Nora looked from his face to the warm light of the house below, at the patched-together fences, and the promise of a new day. She had come to this place with nothing, a woman whose future had been erased. Now, standing on this cold, wind-swept hill, she had everything that mattered. "Looks like we got some rebuilding to do," Silas said, quietly, his gaze steady on hers. He squeezed her hand. "Together." The word hung in the crisp, clean air, a promise as solid and enduring as the mountains that stood guard around them. It was not an ending, but a foundation, and together they turned and walked back down toward the warm yellow light of home. Some journeys aren't measured in the miles traveled, but in the quiet acts of courage that turn a cold shelter into a warm home. In the heart of the frontier, The greatest treasures weren't veins of silver or acres of land, but the strength of a hand to hold during the storm and the sound of a voice that finally breaks the silence. Thank you for spending some time with us at Whispering Creek. If this story of how a family can be forged in fire and ice warmed your heart, we'd be honored if you'd simply leave a 1 in the comments below. It's a quiet way of letting us know these stories have found a good home with you. There are countless tales waiting to be told across the plains, each one a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. To hear them, be sure to subscribe to our channel and join our circle. The next trail is waiting, and we'd be mighty glad to have you ride along with us.